Today Matter.
Thank you very much. I just want to say a quick thank you to Eddie and to Thula for putting on a fantastic conference, and to all of you for attending. I'm going to start with two apologies. One, I haven't got my glasses, and the print is very small. So when you ask questions, a wave would be wonderful. And secondly, clearly I took the joy of Germany crashing out of the World Cup far too well yesterday, and so my voice is slightly hoarse, again, for which I apologise. Okay, so throughout its short and turbulent existence, Rhodesia has been referred to as many different things. For some, this quiet little English suburb, masquerading as a nation, affectionately dubbed Basingstoke in the bush, evoked all that was most captivating about Britain's imperial past, where order and good sense prevailed. To most, however, its story is one of the delinquent and belligerent actions of a right-wing political movement that was elected into power by a whites-only electorate to defend white settler interests under a racially discriminatory franchise. Internationally, the country was declared a threat to global peace, and the UN imposed selective and subsequently mandatory sanctions against it in the late 1960s. It became an illegal, illiberal pariah state. Though somewhat inflammatory, to certain members of the British and American press, it was both England's El Dorado, her Cuba, and her Vietnam all rolled into one. From the point that Prime Minister Ian Smith issued his unilateral declaration of independence on Armistice Day 1965, the problem of Rhodesia weighed heavily around the necks of successive British policymakers. Though clearly a British constitutional responsibility, as the Cold War reached southern Africa, the survival of the illegal regime swiftly became a substantial issue in Anglo-American relations too, so much so that, by the end of 1966, Downing Street regarded it as, quote, an essential part of our cooperation in world affairs. Moreover, despite Conservative Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher and Foreign Secretary Peter Carrington's efforts to solve the crisis unilaterally, the eventual settlement of the Rhodesian crisis at Lancaster House, some 15 years later, owed much to these combined diplomatic efforts. And yet, as Andy DeRoche pinpoints in his recent book, Kenneth Kaunda, The United States and Southern Africa, the African dimension to the Anglo-American special relationship has been largely overlooked by scholars of US-UK relations. Conversely, whilst historians of US diplomacy in Africa have accorded the Rhodesian crisis more attention, most studies have two such weaknesses. A, they choose not to consult archival material beyond the United States, and or B, they were published long before the latest documentary material on either side of the Atlantic was available for release. On the other hand, Nancy Mitchell's recent book, Jimmy Carter in Africa, Race in the Cold War, does adopt a multinational approach to archival research, an accolade shared by the work of Carl Watts and Eddie Michel too. Nevertheless, Mitchell's monograph carries with it an underlying conviction that the United States was the senior partner in southern Africa. As a result, her White House-centric narrative focuses firmly upon Washington, pays British and South African policies, capacities and interests vis-à-vis Rhodesia little attention, and ignores London's long, complicated and turbulent relationship with her former colony. Furthermore, Mitchell makes no attempt to evaluate the state of the special relationship. Thus, availing of the latest documentary evidence collected in Britain, the United States, South Africa and Canada, I will analyse Anglo-American cooperation in Rhodesia from 1977, when Jimmy Carter entered the White House, up until May 1979, when Jim Callaghan left Downing Street. The central purpose of this chapter is to question how and why the United States worked with the UK so closely in southern Africa. By contrast, Whitehall's rationale for seeking to involve the Carter administration was comparatively straightforward. The Callaghan government judged that Britain lacked the economic or military power to negotiate and implement a solution alone. Determined to rid themselves of their Rhodesian headache, British policymakers were eager to continue the close cooperation that had begun in 1976 with Henry Kissinger. The case of US and UK diplomacy with respect to Rhodesia is of significance for scholarly understanding of the resolution of the problem itself, but, moreover, it is also revealing for what it discloses about Anglo-American relations in the 1970s. It sheds light both upon the US and UK's coordination of Cold War strategy and policy, and more widely upon the two nation-states' increasingly asymmetric relationship. The case shows that, first, the special relationship was a distinctly malleable construct, dependent upon the capacities, characters, and propensities of the officials involved, and the political contexts within which they interacted. Alternatively expressed, the Anglo-American special relationship in this period was neither universally nor uniformly special. Its application and form varied spatially and intertemporally. Secondly, as the examples of Callaghan, Owen, Carter, and Vance in this study highlights, personality and friendship, so often relegated to the margins of diplomatic studies, can and did play a significant role in international policymaking. The election of Jimmy Carter to the White House in January 1977 was a great unknown for the British. Quote, "We know less about President-elect Carter and his future intentions than has been the case with any other recent incoming president," bemoaned one British embassy official. Much encouragement was taken, nonetheless, from Carter's moralistic agenda, absolute commitment to human rights, and loathing of racial discrimination, products of his own experience of the struggle for civil rights in Georgia. As the British ambassador to Washington, Peter Ramsbottom, advised, Carter was likely to lend his full support vis-à-vis Rhodesia, to Britain vis-à-vis Rhodesia, due to a commitment to the black community at home, who had played a vital part in his razor-thin margin of victory in the 1976 presidential race. Equally, Carter's choice of senior staff also gave Downing Street hope for support. Expectations were high after the appointment of strong proponents of racial equality to key positions of authority, including the noted Anglophile Cyrus Vance as Secretary of State, Anthony Lake as Director of Policy Planning, and Richard Moose as Assistant Secretary of State for African Affairs. Even Carter's more hawkish choice for National Security Advisor, Zbigniew Brzezinski, believed that ending minority rule was in the US's long-term interest. This said, the embodiment of the fledgling administration's approach to equal rights, both at home and abroad, was Carter's wildcard pick for UN Ambassador Andrew Young. To the British Consulate General in Atlanta, Frank Kennedy, as a civil rights veteran and former aide to Martin Luther King Jr., Young was, quote, "a symbol of racial reconciliation," and would, in his view, clearly be an enormous asset. I hope you can see that. After just 2 days in office, Carter dispatched his vice president, Walter Mondale, for substantive talks in London, with Rhodesia to figure prominently on the agenda. In Whitehall, this was viewed as a perfect opportunity to ensure that Britain was seen as a natural partner for consultation from the outset. They were not to be disappointed. Mondale assured that his government sought continuity in the US's friendships, especially with the United Kingdom. Furthermore, in southern Africa, the president felt very strongly about the need for majority rule and promised full support to the Labour government in their efforts. Over the next month, however, Washington became increasingly frustrated by the UK's gloomy outlook on southern African affairs. Still reeling from the collapse of the last Rhodesia conference in Geneva, as Foreign Secretary Crosland admitted to Young, "We have no idea what to do next." It's as simple as that. In fact, so desperate had the situation become that British embassy personnel were instructed to float the idea in Washington of calling time on Rhodesia completely. To make matters worse, Crosland's untimely death from a stroke on the 19th of February added further delay and disorientation into the mix. Frustration aside, British hopes of persuading the US to assume a proactive role in Rhodesia were boosted tenfold by the roaring success of Prime Minister Jim Callaghan's first visit to the White House in March 1977. As Times correspondent Fred Emery reported, from their very first handshake, quote, "all was jollity between the two leaders, and a spirit of uncommon jocularity was soon descended." Warned by Callaghan that the choice might well be between civil war in southern Africa and a greater use of US muscle, Carter pledged once more to back the British to the hilt, to press for the repeal of the Byrd Amendment, and assured that he did not view the Rhodesian problem in the clear-cut terms of communism versus the free world or black versus white. This said, in spite of the special personal relationship that developed between Carter and Callaghan, this commitment stemmed more from a calculated pursuit of American interests than from any desire to pull the British chestnuts from the fire. Nonetheless, in the context of Anglo-American cooperation, this mattered little. What counted was that the Carter administration would now pursue the joint approach the Labour leadership so desperately craved. The appointment of David Owen as Foreign Secretary brought renewed urgency to the Rhodesian negotiations. Unlike his predecessor, the more ambitious Owen hankered after a distinctive foreign policy of his own, longing for what Tony Benn dubbed a grand Kissinger-style Owen settlement of Africa. Aware of how critical South Africa would be to any lasting settlement, Owen also recognised that the best way to put pressure on Pretoria was through the Americans. To achieve this, he prioritised and quickly established a firm friendship with Cyrus Vance, in his view, as close as has ever existed between a US Secretary of State and British Foreign Secretary. Acutely aware of the problems encountered at Geneva over the coming weeks, Owen and Vance agreed to turn the earlier strategy upside down. Instead of trying to form an interim government that would take 18 months to work out a constitution, they would now stage consultations with the leading protagonists, draft a constitution themselves, and then convene an all-party conference to discuss it. Only after these three steps had been accomplished would the terms for the transfer of power be up for debate. To Owen's delight, Vance agreed to co-sponsor the venture and promised to send a strong delegation to the conference itself. Keen to make progress, Owen set off on a familiarisation tour of Africa to test the water in April 1977. With tensions still running high, it quickly became clear that neither the white Rhodesians nor the Zimbabwean nationalists were willing to compromise. There is, he reported back to the House of Commons, a desperate lack of trust which must now be rebuilt. Abandoning any idea of an early constitutional conference, Owen and Vance determined that low-key groundwork had the greatest hope of success. And to this end, on the 6th of May, an Anglo-American consultative group, co-headed by John Graham, Deputy Undersecretary for African and Middle Eastern Affairs at the Foreign and Commonwealth Office, and Stephen Lowe, the US Ambassador to Lusaka, was established. After 4 months of roving negotiations, Graham and Lowe forwarded their tentative conclusions, the essence of which would become to form the AAP, or Anglo-American Proposals. Principally, these called for a transfer of power to an interim British administration, a new from-scratch constitution, a ceasefire to be maintained by an international peacekeeping force, a £15 million development fund, and free and fair elections based upon equal franchise and universal suffrage. Moreover, on the crucial issue of who controlled the ministries of law and order, deemed the principal stumbling block to peace in Rhodesia, it was proposed that, to satisfy both sides, government and guerrilla forces would be amalgamated into the post-independence army. Whatever hopes the British might have had were quickly dashed, nonetheless, when Jimmy Carter decided to shift unilaterally the goalposts in play. Deeming it vital to obtain a more concrete endorsement from the frontline presidents, during a summit with the Tanzanian leader Julius Nyerere, Carter pledged that the new Zimbabwean army would in fact be based primarily on the liberation forces, i.e. the nationalist guerrillas. Critically aware that this would never be acceptable to Salisbury nor to Pretoria, when news of the exchange reached London, Owen was left visibly upset. Resigned to the fact that Britain constituted little more than a paper tiger over Rhodesia, rather than allowing this incident to disrupt Anglo-American cooperation, the Foreign Secretary fudged as best he could. Firstly, by pressing for the term primarily to be dropped, and secondly, by persuading Vance to support the idea of incorporating the existing Rhodesian police into the army. Picking up from where the consultative group had left off, In September, Owen embarked upon another whirlwind tour of southern Africa to present the final proposals with Andrew Young in tow. An odd choice, perhaps, given the UN ambassador's tendency, in Owen's phrase, to shoot from the lip. By this point, for many in the Foreign Office, Young's activism cum diplomacy epitomised the naive, irresponsible side of Carter's foreign policy. His willingness to criticise the British, accusing them of having invented racism live on the BBC, and believing them far too inclined to favour the whites, had landed him in hot water on more than one occasion. In the long run, however, this was of little consequence. As Owen had anticipated, the Rhodesian leader derided the proposals as crazy, insane, and a cunning scheme to sweep the guerrillas to power. Both Ian Smith and South African Prime Minister John Vorster were scathing about the suggestion to incorporate any patriotic front forces into the new Zimbabwean army whatsoever. As they closed ranks, the Anglo-American proposals swiftly fell apart. Though Smith had toyed with the concept of an internal solution from January 1977 onwards, its realisation just over a year later, in the form of the Salisbury Agreement, took the Anglo-American partners by surprise. Having forged an alliance with several black moderates, the Rhodesian leader hoped that, by implementing the original package offered to him by Henry Kissinger in 1976, he could create a moderate and multiracial society that would eventually gain international approval. His gambit was boosted no end when Pretoria sided with him. In her account of the Carter administration's role in Rhodesia, historian Nancy Michel claims that the former governor of Georgia never wavered in his intention to veto any solution that did not include the nationalist guerrillas. For the British, she writes, the bar was far lower. In addition, she also argues that, behind the scenes, the US stiffened London's back and pushed it always to include the Patriotic Front. From the documents examined here, throughout my PhD, in fact, it wasn't just Whitehall who gave the plan serious thought. For instance, when John Vorster first pitched the idea to them, neither Owen nor Vance believed the scheme would win adequate African support or bring about an end to the violence in Rhodesia. Nevertheless, aware that the notion could be popular in Congress and in Parliament, the US Secretary of State insisted that it should not be rejected out of hand. Likewise, Ambassador Stephen Lowe and Brzezinski, as this slide shows, believed the settlement could, perhaps, offer a viable path towards majority rule. Only Andrew Young was immediate in his rebuff, forecasting that it could create a black-on-black civil war. With such a breadth of opinion amongst his foreign policy team, not to mention emanating from his primary negotiating partners in London, Carter stressed caution and briefed Vance and Young neither to support nor reject the agreement. If anything, he leaned toward Brzezinski's position. Whether some in Carter's administration saw it as their job to keep London's feet to the fire or not, when Owen travelled to the White House in late March, the minutes of the meeting evidenced little disagreement. At no point did any member of the US delegation accuse the British of being too anti-patriotic front. On the contrary, it was Owen who lamented that they could not stretch the AAP much further through concession to the guerrillas. As the violence in Rhodesia worsened, British and American calls for a diplomatic solution had less and less of an impact. As Owen conceded, by June 1978, their goal was now just to keep the diplomatic ball in play. This said, as the pressure of successive failures began to mount, a new and more covert strategy was contemplated. Several in the Foreign Office, including Owen himself, were persuaded that the internal settlement could be workable if Joshua Nkomo could be persuaded to break his alliance with Robert Mugabe and join the government. Counter to Mitchell's view that Washington remained adamant that the Allies do nothing to fracture the front, both Vance and Owen tried to convince the South Africans to pressure Smith into agreement. They succeeded, and a meeting between Smith and Nkomo was held on the 14th of August in Lusaka. When news of the secret parley broke out, however, all hell was let loose. Not only did it undermine the fragile union within the Patriotic Front, worse still, Nkomo's subsequent attempt to take credit for shooting down an Air Rhodesia passenger jet and executing 10 of the 18 survivors on the ground made any hope of further negotiations all but impossible. With a diplomatic solution looking unlikely, in mid-September, the Allies decided to put their efforts on hold and began to explore options independently. Whilst Vance pushed for another conference in New York, the British investigated an even more controversial option, an offer by Rhodesia's beleaguered JOC for a coup d'etat and an immediate renouncement of UDI. With cooperation starting to flounder, Brzezinski judged there to be little hope of achieving a solution in line with the AAP and urged Carter to quietly disengage from the negotiating process, handing the problem over to the British or to the UN. Whether this shift was a knee-jerk reaction or, as several scholars now contend, representative of an essential continuity in Carter's initial approach to foreign affairs, the inability of US policymakers to escape the East-West paradigm after this point drove a notable wedge between London and Washington. Of equal detriment to Anglo-American planning was the ever-increasing level of domestic pressure on Carter's government to endorse the internal settlement. Of 67 major US newspapers surveyed in October 1978, current US policy was opposed by a ratio of almost 3 to 1. Moreover, as a congressional effort led by rookie Senator Jesse Helms earlier that summer nearly succeeded in forcing the president to lift the UN sanctions imposed upon Rhodesia in the early 1960s. Under fire at home, the American reaction to Callahan's decision in November to send former Cabinet Minister Cledwyn Hughes on a fact-finding mission to Rhodesia was at best indifferent. When he reported back that, unsurprisingly, conditions remained unsuitable for another all-party conference, this effectively signalled the end of the US-UK joint venture. Alarmed by Whitehall's desperation and irritated by their shortage of ideas, when Callahan tried to obtain Carter's written endorsement for a return trip in April 1979, the president's instructions were clear: we do not join in this. Drawing together some very tentative thoughts, which apparently apparently it's not going to show my conclusion slide, so we'll have to go off-piste. Drawing together some very tentative thoughts, though in terms of immediate success, the story of Rhodesia from 77 to 79 may not exhibit the Anglo-American partnership in its best light, it is still significant because it paved the way for Lancaster House under Margaret Thatcher. Moreover, for scholars of Anglo-American relations, the extent of cooperation on show is still remarkable, especially so given the increasingly skewed power dynamic between London and Washington. Nevertheless, this did not mean that the UK played the junior role, blindly followed the US lead, or simply did what it was told. Where instances of disagreement could otherwise have developed into major ruptures, particularly after the Carter-Nyerere exchange in Washington, a combination of Whitehall's determination to rid itself of Rhodesia and an acceptance of Britain's diminished world status, the Labour leadership's unshakable commitment to the special relationship and the use of this connection to further British interests, and the close personal friendships that existed between many of the major players involved ensured that relations remained cordial. Equally, the evidence examined here also brings under scrutiny several oversights in the existing historical record of the Carter government's role in ending the Rhodesian rebellion. Whilst it is fair to conclude that the US made a significant contribution under Carter, to imply that it was his administration, more so than Callahan's, or indeed the Commonwealth, that made the eventual settlement in Rhodesia possible greatly undersells the work done by the British Labour government and the Foreign and Commonwealth Office. It can, in fact, be argued just as easily that, like Kissinger, however controversial, at times Carter's actions were as much of a hindrance as help to progress in Rhodesia. Equally, though it is certainly true that, like many in the US, Whitehall had long preferred for a moderate candidate like Nkomo to lead the new Zimbabwean nation, this did not mean that they were prejudiced against the Patriotic Front as a whole. Moreover, conflicting with Mitchell's assertion that Carter himself never wavered in his determination to reject the internal settlement, in reality this just wasn't the case. as the record clarifies, the Allies' lack of success in winning support for their diplomatic solution, the AAP, ensured that neither London nor Washington was willing to rule out completely any agreement. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you, Todd. I just have one quick question. You've discussed the role of morality as shaping Carter's approach toward Rhodesia. How would you contrast that with the moral approach of Jerry Ford?
Thank you for that very loaded question that we've already talked about. I need it after last night. I would contrast it in the sense that I think Carter's is built much more of a moralistic sense of Christianity, of Christian belief, moralism, moral kind of projection. I would say that Ford's is much more based upon a sporting and sense of fair play. I think his college background, given that he has no expertise in foreign affairs, is crucial to the way in which he tries to conduct foreign policy, especially given that Kissinger is the operator, the major operator at this point. I think Ford's moralism is, if anything, I think, less manufactured. I think it is more genuine, though definitely less well developed, if that's a good enough answer. Yeah.
Todd, thank you very much indeed. I would just like to ask your view of thinking inside the Foreign Office. You skirted very quickly towards the end of your paper of the emissary of Claiborne Hughes going down to Rhodesia, and then you skipped on to April 1979 when Callaghan makes that statement. But at that critical point, the Foreign Office is actually going through a very detailed review in its very tiny Rhodesian department. Do you see actually thinking in Whitehall, saying that trying to use the Anglo-American dynamic has not worked for British policy, so that there is also parallel thinking saying we need to put the Americans aside, that is developing among British bureaucrats? So this process also shows part of the evolution of British policy, and the use of foreign personal in diplomacy hasn't worked. So just to set those parallel streams in play.
I would pinpoint the move of Robin Renwick to head the Rhodesia department as critical to that. I think he comes in with an informed view based upon previous experience in the Foreign and Commonwealth Office. I certainly think that he believes Callaghan and especially Owen are far too attached to America, and particularly to the Carter government. I think this is the point in time when you start to see, given what's going on for Carter around the world and domestically, you start to see the Foreign Office losing interest in such close cooperation. I think this is particularly from the British Embassy. You start to see Peter Ramsbottom and Peter Jay reporting back that Carter is not going to last for a second election, and we need to be thinking about, if the Labour government is going to at this point they presume win, then we need to be looking at another initiative. They talk quite at length in some of the Prem files I was looking through a few weeks ago about a UN initiative. They're much more interested in discussing things with Sonny Rampal, and he becomes a much more informed figure in British plans. You don't see that in kind of 77, 78. You do in the early 79. So yeah, I would completely say that it's a shifting point in the Foreign Office, into internal kind of dynamics as well.
Look, as you mentioned now, of course, the predominant view is the UK, US hoped for Nkrumah to be moderate enough, maybe to join Mujareva, or at least were against the Mugabe's victory. But when you speak to ZAPU people, or former ZAPU who are in ZANU-PF now, several persons were telling me that the West supported Mugabe and they were afraid of ZAPU winning because of the danger of the ANC presence there, etc., etc. Did you find anything on this?
So it's a really good question. Not a huge amount. There's much more, I think, in the Carter Library that discusses this than there is in the Foreign Office. I think they're less interested in let me put it a different way. They're more interested in appearances than who they actually believe is going to become leader. I think they're much more interested in projecting a view of fairness. I think that they aren't interested in prioritising Nkomo, particularly after the Viscount incident. I think he becomes discredited in their eyes completely. And the kind of preference towards him is a long kind of fought thing within the Foreign Office throughout the 1960s and the early 70s. He's seen as a preferential candidate, but I mean, only as soon as Thatcher comes in do you get the kind of very disrespectful comments about Mugabe and Nkomo. You don't see that from the Callaghan government or from Owen. I didn't find a huge amount really discussing who they prioritise from mid-78 onwards. I think, to be honest, they're growing so desperate by this point that they don't really care as long as it's accepted by the frontline states, to be honest.
Todd, thank you very much for that presentation. I had a quick question. It's really just a silly detail type of thing, and then a comment or suggestion. When you went through the historiography, you had a nice slide, which I very much enjoyed seeing my own books up there, of course. But there was one book I didn't recognize, and Eddie's was there, and Carl Watts, and Nancy, and Tom Knorr, who's a good old friend of mine. But there was one, and I was just wondering what it was.
I can get back to it. Hold on.
Okay. And then the suggestion, and I'm sure you're going to do this, it's the one with the very colorful Africa map. Whose book is that?
That's a book by James Hubbard. It's more of an overview. I think it was written from purely American sources, and it's intended to be a primer. But I found it useful in looking at the US's attitude towards Africa in general. Okay, well, thanks for that. And then suggestion, and again, something you're probably going to do anyway, as you go forward, thinking about the special relationship and the United States diplomats and the British diplomats and who's more in control or more influential, and that's a very, very good line of analysis. But also I would encourage you to think about their reputation or their influence or their impact among both white and black Africans, especially in Rhodesia, but not only in Rhodesia, Zimbabwe, also in Zambia and South Africa, because what they say and what they try to do is one thing, but the end of the story is going to be in Zimbabwe. It's not going to be in London. It's not going to be in Washington. So, how effective were they, and how, either popular or, despised. I mean, anyway, I'm sure you're going to get into all that, but I look forward to reading it. No, it's a good point. I go into it in a little more. This is a very abridged version of the paper I submitted, but I can give a very tentative kind of my viewpoint on it. But that's a really important point that doesn't really come up in this. Obviously, Andrew Young gets on famously with the Zimbabwean nationalists, and I think that contrast that with Owen. I mean, Owen couldn't get on with people in the Foreign Office, so what he must have been like for people outside of that, I don't hold much hope. Callaghan's reputation, I think, is particularly with Nyerere and with Kaunda, is much better. I think this goes back to his desire to rebuild links with the Commonwealth and to rebuild links with Africa, and that were really neglected under Heath. And he makes that a really central part of his foreign policy portfolio when he's Foreign Secretary and then when he's Prime Minister. In terms of Vance and Carter is very well respected. I think he's seen as... I think the frontline presidents see him as an easy touch and somebody that can be worked much more easily perhaps than the British. I do think that they try and manipulate his moralistic agenda. I don't think they do so with Vance, but I don't get the same impression that Vance's personality comes through. And Brzezinski, again, they are not the same level of interaction. It is very much Young's venture, and Young is the personification for most of the frontline presidents and for the nationalist guerrillas of American policy. Yeah. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks for the paper. A quick one, small one, maybe unfair. Where was the special relationship during the Suez crisis? Why the special relationship with Rhodesia? Where is the special relationship now?
That's right. Okay. Well, Suez is very important to this. Suez and the disastrous ramifications for prestige, or British governing prestige, particularly of the Conservative government. Eden and a lot of his followers, particularly at that point, are disgraced. And I think there is certainly, this creates a sense in Washington of, well, we may not be able to trust the British on this. They aren't as enlightened as they like to think they are. I think that's really fundamental in the way that they approach this. There's a great book called Reassessing Suez that's edited by Sarah Stockwell that I think you contributed to. Yeah, is fantastic on this. Why Rhodesia? Why Rhodesia in Anglo-American relations? I think that it's something that hasn't really been looked at before. I think it's something that is it reveals a lot about not just the dynamic of the relationship itself, but also in this kind of period from 63, 64 until 80, this hinterland within Anglo-American relations historiography. These are seen as the barren years, and they're not. They're more subtle than that. It's not just sandwiched between the great Thatcher-Reagan relationship and the fantastic Kennedy-Macmillan relationship. It's much more fluctuating. It's much more free-flowing than that. And I think personality comes through as a really important point in this. Where is it now? I think it's like it has been since its creation. It's a lot more important to London than it is to Washington. I think just before I came here, I remember reading news about how Trump has now decided that he'll make a second visit to London, and how for the vast majority of the British public this is a disaster. There will be huge riots and not riots. The British don't riot, as in maybe huge protests. But I don't think after Brexit that Britain holds anything that really draws it to the United States. I think it's been on a downward spiral of importance, really obviously from Cameron and Obama onwards. And I think that the last real special relationship we will see will be the Blair-Bush axis, shall we say. Thank you.